During this video on creating custom plant symbols, we will walk through modifying an existing plant symbol as well as creating a plant symbol from scratch. This will allow you to customize the plant symbols to your design style. Now, before we go through the process of starting to walk through how we can modify those custom plant symbols or creating a custom plant symbol, I will just end up using the plant tool just to get two symbols placed here in the document. Now, just placing these plant symbols here in the document will end up allowing us to take a look at the classes that automatically come in with our plant symbols. Now, these classes that do automatically come in with our plant symbols are used to be able to control the individual components within that plant symbol. It allows it so that we can have a variety of different plants in our document, and that if I wanted to control the visibility of all of the blooms from all of my plants, I would be able to just go to that bloom class, make it become invisible, and then that bloom geometry from all of my plants would end up being invisible as well. So just keeping these classes set to where they don't actually have graphical attributes applied, again, makes it so that each one of my plants can have a different fill color, different graphical attributes, but yet that geometry is still associated with the same class throughout all of the plant symbols. Now, we can always end up utilizing one of our plant symbols from our plant library or even from that plant tool dropdown that we just saw. And we can always go in and we can modify that geometry. So maybe we wanted to change the fill color for that 2D representation. So that's one of the ways that we can go through creating our own custom symbols. So utilizing some of the symbols that we already have and modifying it. We can also end up going through the process of creating our own custom plant symbol from scratch. So starting off with geometry and then us going through that process of modifying it and adding that fill color. So we'll actually go through both of those options to be able to show you how you can customize those plant symbols so that they fit for your design. Now, the first option that we will end up going through is we'll end up utilizing one of the plant symbols from our libraries. So just going through the resource browser, I have ended up adding the plant objects library to my resource browser into that favorites section. Just gives me that quick access to be able to access those resources. So to be able to start modifying the symbol, I do have to end up adding it into the document first. So we'll just end up adding a symbol here into the document first. Now, once I get it added from that original library, I do need to make sure that I end up switching that resource browser so it's looking at my active document. Now, usually what I end up doing is that once we have that symbol in the document, I do go through the process of renaming that symbol, simply so that if I wanted to end up utilizing that same shape and with the colors there, that I wouldn't end up having a naming conflict. So if I am going to end up modifying a symbol, I do usually go through the process of making sure to rename it. Now, I'll end up using this plant symbol as to start off for a hydrangea macrophylla, so endless summer. So we'll just end up renaming it with that same name. So once we get that name updated, then what we can end up doing is this is where we can then start to go and edit the 2D component. So if it is where you like the shape, the geometry, but maybe we want to be able to adjust that gradient for the bloom, this is where then what we'll do is we'll go into the 2D graphics of that symbol. So I'll still work through that resource browser, going into edit that symbol. Now we will end up selecting that 2D graphic option. And once we're in that edit mode, so I mentioned that the classes set up do relate or to the different components here of the geometry in this symbol. So to be able to take a look at, well, what pieces of geometry are within which class, I can always switch my class options over to active only. So this is where I can take a look at what geometry is in the bloom class, the color fill, and even the outline. So this is one way that can help isolate that specific geometry. So since we are interested in wanting to change that bloom color, well, I could always change the class options to active only and then select that class. Now, the other way that we can always use is that if I do keep my class options set to show snap modify others, this is where I can end up using that select similar tool and going into the preferences and making sure that I want to select the geometry with the same fill attributes. So this is where using that select similar, I can quickly grab all of those polylines with that same fill color. Well, what we'll do is that we'll end up utilizing this pink blossom gradient, but because I don't know where this pink blossom could also be used throughout my file, I'm going to end up duplicating it so that when I make a modification to it, it won't affect any other instances that have this exact same gradient name. Now, changing this gradient, it will be where that maybe depending on the time of year or to accommodate for the pH of the soil, this is where that we can come in and we can edit that gradient to reflect again that time of year, the soil, or whatever you may need to have represented for your project. So we'll just come in, make adjustment to that gradient. Well, because we already have all of that geometry selected and then we've updated that gradient, this is where I can just double click on that gradient to have it apply to all of that geometry. Now when I return back to the main document, to my design layer, so I do see that update, and also in the resource browser I will see that symbol update as well. Well, I know that we've gone through there to edit that graphical attribute, so the 2D geometry. But what I also want to be able to do is, because since we ended up changing the name to that hydrangea, I also want to be able to edit the definition as well. So this is where, again, just through that resource browser, and using the option to right-click edit through the resource browser allows it so that all of my instances of that symbol in the document would update versus just this one. So this is where we're going to go into the definition. And once we're in this edit definition dialog box, this is where I can click on that get plant data, and this is where I'm able to pull and access that exact same plant name so that I can have that information already generated for me, so I don't have to end up typing it all in from scratch. Also, once we have that set, this is where we can also adjust the spread, the height, and the spacing. Again, especially when it comes to that spacing aspect, depending on what you may need or how you want those plants in that project, you can always kind of adjust that plant spacing to how you would like to have those displayed. So now we do see that information update as well. So again, that we can end up doing that right-click edit to be able to edit the 2D graphics. So again, if I like the original shape of what that symbol looked like, but maybe I wanted to modify the fill to the bloom or even that color fill, that's where going through and editing the 2D graphics allows me to make those changes to that geometry. If I want to be able to set specific information to that plant, well, then that's where going into doing that right-click edit, going into the definition, and we're able to grab that information for that plant. Now, the next option we're going to end up working through is, what if I don't see from one of these libraries? Maybe whether it's the Plant Objects or the Plant Objects 2 library, maybe there's not quite the shape that I'm really looking for. So how can I end up creating a plant from scratch and being able to, choose my geometry and then also being able to add a fill color to it as well? So this next option we'll walk through is that how can I go about creating that custom plant symbol from scratch? Now, what I did end up doing is I did end up creating a plants proposed class. So plants can have an overall class. So this is where for the overall class, I'll put it in this just plants proposed class. But like what we just saw when we were editing that hydrangea, that within the plant symbol, there's also individual classes as well. So the plant can have an overall class, and then like what we just saw, the individual components also have their own class as well. Now, starting off from scratch, I'll just end up keeping it simple, and we'll just end up utilizing a circle to start off here. Now, I usually like to work from the bottom of the geometry upward, and so that's where I'll end up starting off just with the outline. So with that, this is where we'll just select that circle, and from that attributes pad, I'll just switch it so that there's no solid fill. Now, all I need to just start off this plant is just geometry. So this is where, just starting off with that circle, now I can go up to that landmark menu and then create new plant. Now, this plant that we'll make is we'll end up going through and creating a Japanese maple, so that Acer palmatum atropurpureum. Now, also like what we did for the hydrangea, this is also where we can click on that option for Get Plant Data. And this again just allows it so that we can grab that information for the plant and that there's already that preset information in there. So I just will change for the plant list. So once we have that selected, again, we do see information that automatically comes in instead of me having to type all of that from scratch. Once we get back to this Edit Plant Definition dialog box, if you did need to modify any of that plant data, well then I can always come to this Plant Data tab and to be able to adjust that information. Now I will update the insertion options for this plant. So just adjusting, and again, that depending on the plant, on what you may need for the spread or the spacing, or the height that you may need, again, depending on how old or young the plant may be, you can always come in here and modify those numbers. All right, so with that set, this is where we can go ahead and click OK. Now, right now, this is where we do just see the outline for that Japanese maple. So this is where we'll go through that process like what we did for the hydrangea and editing it through the resource browser. So we'll just do the right click edit. We'll go in and we're going to end up editing the 2D graphics. Now, when we originally created that circle, it was in the plants proposed class, but I actually need to put it into the correct class. So this is where I need to make sure that I put this geometry into the plants component outline class. And we will just accept those class attributes. Now, also, and why we're going to start just from the bottom up is because when I want to make sure that my outline is at the bottom of all of that geometry, so that if I wanted to be able to create a massing for my plants, I would have the correct representation. So if you didn't happen to have that outline at the very bottom of all of your geometry, then you just end up using those send options to make sure to send it to the back. So again, we just want to make sure that that outline is all the way at the very bottom of the stack. Now, so that I keep just the same alignment, this is where I'll end up just copying this and then also just pasting it in place. Now for this next piece, this is where we're going to end up setting the canopy. So I do want to have a solid fill to this, but I do not want an outline. Now what we'll also end up doing is that, again, since I copy and pasted it, I do need to change it to the correct class. So we're going to end up placing this into the canopy class, and that canopy class actually already has an opacity set to it, because depending on the tree, you would be able to see the other plants or objects underneath it. The reason why we're not going to end up placing it into the color fill class is that color fill class, it's a solid fill color. There's no opacity set to that class. So that would be where maybe for more of those perennials or ground covers, that's where you would end up seeing the color fill, the geometry in the color fill class, because it's going to be solid. But that with different trees, and again, depending on the design or the tree type, that if that geometry does need to be able to have that opacity to see through underneath, we are going to make sure that we put it into that canopy class. We'll end up reusing this red foliage gradient, but like what we did last time is that we can end up duplicating it again, because if I want to make changes to this gradient, I don't know where this gradient is also reused in the document, and I wouldn't want to affect or change that display in my other plants in my document. So I'll just end up, we'll still leave it that -2 there, and just making that update. Now with that canopy circle selected, this is where I can just double click to be able to apply that red foliage gradient to that circle. Now if I wanted, one of the ways that I could adjust, so maybe where I wanted to adjust that highlight, so I could always go into that gradient, fill gradient settings dialog box, and that I could always change the type. Maybe I wanted to actually be radial versus linear. You can always come in and type in specific numbers in this dialog box. So I do see that change. However, if I wanted to further modify it just even a little bit more, this is where I could end up using my attribute mapping tool. So the attribute mapping tool does allow me to, again, if I wanted to, kind of change where that highlight or the focus is, I could again end up using that attribute mapping tool to further modify that gradient. So where do I want that shading to be displayed? Do I want to change basically the angle? So that's just really nice in being able to use that attribute mapping tool. Well, the other and last piece that we'll end up changing or adding into this symbol is we'll end up adding just some interior line work. And so this is where, again, that just depending on what you may want or have, want to have represented for your plant symbol, then you can always add in what details you may need or want to be able to create that custom look that you may want. Now once I activate that select similar tool, I do just need to come back in and adjust those preferences, just because I don't need to have, lines don't have fill attributes, so that would be where, just to be able to grab all of those lines. And then just quickly being able to grab those lines with that select similar tool just makes it so that when I do need to put those into that interior line work class, that I can just quickly be able to grab them. Well, now that we have those graphical attributes set for this plant, this is where we can turn back to the document. So I do see also that representation in my resource browser update as well. Now, the reason why we also made sure that when we were going through to make sure that the specific geometry in this Japanese maple that we created, why we wanted to make sure that they were in the specific class is so that with this combination of plant symbols that were from Vectorworks, but then also a plant symbol that we created from scratch. If I wanted it to be able to behave as all of the other plant symbols in the document, that's where I just would want to be able to have that consistency. So if I wanted that interior line work to be hidden, then when I change that class, then the interior line work on all of mine, so whether it's custom or one that was from one of the libraries, would end up having that adjustment as well. And same thing for the color fill, as the color fill has that solid. This is where that it affects only those two perennials that we have, or the canopy. So again, for the two trees with that opacity. So that's where I like to be able to have plants added in the document first, so that I already have all of those classes set up, so that when I am creating my own custom plant, that I can end up changing the geometry into that specific class correctly. Now, the other aspect that we can end up doing for this custom plant is that we can also end up adding 3D geometry or 3D rendering for it. These plants that we already used from Vectorworks do also have a 3D representation as well, and they end up using image props for that 3D representation. We can do that same thing to our custom plant symbol that we created from scratch here, and so we can also go in and we can edit the 3D component as well. So I'll still go through that process of just editing through the resource browser and going into the 3D graphics. Now, what will end up being used in here in this 3D, for the 3D graphics, will be an image prop. And what we can do is that we can link to our image props for this to be able to add in this 3D representation. Now, going into my, navigating to my Vectorworks libraries, and going into my plant images folder. So we do have a variety of XFrog folders that we can have access to. So if you were more looking for an artistic look, there is this artistic folder that you can come in and have access to those different options there. For us, for this example, we'll just end up going into this photorealistic folder. So just keep in mind that there are different folders that we have access to depending on what we just want represented there for this custom symbol. Now we'll end up just selecting this deciduous broadleaf, the A through E library here. And so once I add this into my favorites, so then this is where again I just have quicker access to those resources in that library. Now taking a look at these 3D views, so these 3D image props. Depending on what time of year you're needing to have that plan represented, you'll see that there's an S, a W, and an A, so spring, winter, and autumn. So again, just depending on what time of year that you want to have represented, if you did want to be able to create that 3D view. Now, how we end up getting this into the 3D, so I'll just end up double clicking on it and just snapping to that 3D locus point. Now when I exit out of the plant, and I return to that isometric view, and I render an OpenGL, then I do see that representation. So again, this is where that to be able to further modify that symbol that we created from scratch, that we can end up going into the 3D component as well to be able to modify and get that look that we may need for our project. Now, if you have gone through the process of modifying some of these symbols, there's also a way that if I wanted to be able to add these symbols to a custom library, I could also go through that process as well. Now, I do already have linked in my favorite section a custom plant library. So like what we did for the hydrangea or the Japanese maple, this is where that once I have those modified, if I want to be able to have those plant symbols in one location so that I can quickly have access to them, this is where that we can end up being able to export that plant. So this is where how we get this hydrangea and that Japanese maple to that custom plant library. This is where that we'll just end up going to export, and wherever you end up having it saved, so I just ended up saving it onto my desktop. So wherever you end up having that library saved is where we would just end up navigating to select it. So now when I take a look at my custom plant library, and again I had just ended up adding a couple different resources in there. This is where we now have that Japanese maple, that Acer palmatum, as well as my hydrangea included as well. Now, one just aspect to mention about this Acer Palmatum that we have included. Because when we were originally creating it from scratch, to be able to get the tag to have that same display as those other plants, this is where if I just end up taking it out of the document and then accessing that plant tool, this is where I will end up seeing that I do have, because we have that plant already used in the document, I can end up selecting that same Acer Palmatum, and now when I go to place it, it'll end up having that tag display as well. So just if for that quick note there on why that tag wasn't updating, it was just because we needed to grab that plant tool and then select that Acer Palmatum from that list to be able to have that display and update. Thank you for watching Creating a Custom Plant Symbol, and we hope that this has helped you learn how to make adjustments to existing symbols and even creating a plant symbol from scratch to be able to help represent that specific design style you want to have represented to your clients.